So thank you, everyone, for joining this morning. This is DePelsham Magruder in Brooklyn, New York. I have two sons who are 9 and 6, and we're very excited to have you all on the call this morning. We just want to start out with an inspirational quote by Chris Baldwin. And Chris, don't forget to press star 6.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Our inspirational quote in honors of Father's Day comes from Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I think that my strong determination for justice comes from the very strong, dynamic personality of my father. I have rarely ever met a person more fearless and courageous than my father. The things that I admire most about my dad is his genuine Christian character. He is a man of real integrity, deeply committed to moral and ethical principles. He is conscious in all of his undertakings. If I had a problem, I could always call Daddy. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers.
Thank you, Chris. And, of course, Father's Day is next weekend, but our call is monthly, so we just wanted to take a moment to honor fathers and the impact that they have on our lives. So up next, I will give a little information about our purpose and mission organizationally. So we have two organizations. Moms of Black Boys United is our 501c3, and the goal is to provide information and support for moms of black sons and also promote positive images of black boys and men. Mob United for Social Change is our 501c4 advocacy organization, and we aim to influence policy that impacts how black boys and men are treated and perceived by law enforcement and society. So these organizations work together. I describe them as both sides of the coin. The first one is focused on what we can do, what we need to know to equip our sons to navigate all of the situations in life they may find themselves in, to raise healthy, productive sons, and to make sure that the positive narratives are getting out there to counter all of the negative ones that we see. And then after we've done all that we can do, we also have to push to change the system, because often us doing our part is not enough. So next page talks a little bit about our approach. We have a 5-point approach, which is to influence policy, change perception, demonstrate our power, that's politically and economically, partner strategically with like-minded individuals and organizations, and to promote self-care, because it's critically important that we also make sure we take care of ourselves health-wise and our families as we're going through all of the things that we face. So that is a little bit about what we're about, and now I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa to tell you about our presence at the Essence Festival.
Good morning, everyone. We're excited to be heading back to the Essence Festival this year, where we will have a booth like we had last year and have the ability to share information about our organization with moms that come in from all over the country for this memorable event. We'll also have an opportunity to share more about Mob United on the center stage this year, which is a great honor that we had last year, and we are grateful that we have the opportunity to do it again this year. Also, for the first time this year, or for the first time ever, we'll be holding our Champions of Change breakfast. This will be a breakfast that is commemorating our 2nd anniversary, as well as honoring moms who have been key forces fighting and advocating for our black sons. So this year, our honorees will be Sabrina Fulton, and who's the mother of Trayvon Martin, and Gwen Carr, who's the mother of Eric Garner. Attendees can expect a delicious Southern breakfast. I myself am very excited for the food in New Orleans. I think I've been starving myself for all year for it, so I'm excited to head back there and to spend this time with my sisters, both locally in New Orleans and moms all over the country.
Thank you, Vanessa. And, of course, if you all are able to join us there, please do. Please meet us there. We'll have a booth and shifts for people to talk about the organization, but it would just be great for you to be there and experience it. We had a wonderful time last year meeting moms from all over the country. Many of them already had heard of the organization and many had not, so it's a great way just to share your experience and get more people involved. Up next, I want to talk about our partnership with Noble. So today's speaker is very timely because we have been and are hosting workshops, interactive workshops, last month and throughout this month in various cities. So far, we've had one in the D.C. area, 2 in Long Island, and today there's one happening actually this morning in Columbus, Georgia, and one later this afternoon at 1 p.m. in Atlanta, Georgia at Morehouse College. Then we have one coming up in Houston, Texas, and Los Angeles, California. So I just want to pause there. If there are any of the organizers on the phone who've either had your Noble Workshop or it's coming up and there's anything like to share about it, please star 6 yourself to unmute now. Don't be shy. I believe I see Melissa on the call.
Hey, Depelsha.
Hi.
It's Patty.
Patty, hi.
Good morning. I am calling in from Atlanta, Georgia, and as Depelsha said, our workshop is today, beginning at 1 o'clock at Morehouse at the Shirley A. Massey Executive Conference Center in the Bank of America Center. We're really looking forward to working with Noble and our MOB chapter here in Atlanta to have the interactive workshop that will teach our teens and tweens how to interact with police, being the main thing that we comply and make sure that we're able to, if there's an injustice, to be able to fight it later. So we're really looking forward to it. We welcome anybody that's in the Atlanta area. Specifically, we are targeting this towards our sons, but we welcome the daughters, men, women, everybody. We're looking forward to welcoming you to this afternoon at 1 o'clock.
Thank you, Patty.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Melissa Clark, are you on?
I'm here. The one we had in the D.C. area was fairly small, but it was really very helpful, I think, for those of us who were there. And also, I learned a lot about sort of the things that I could be doing more in my community to interact with the police officers in my area that I have been passing up out of my own prejudice, to be honest, about what's been going on. So I think it really changed the way I look at things as far as the issues. So I'm looking forward to trying to plan another one that will be accessible to our deaf and hard of hearing moms. We might not be able to get that together till the fall. I'm working with faculty at Gallaudet University on that. But I think I'm also going to recommend that the area middle schools and high schools, they all have NAACP representatives. I'm going to also pass Noble's information along to them as well, or we can work together with them during next school year, I think, to get this directly to more kids. So that's the DC update. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. I remember it sounded like it was a riveting conversation with a lot of exchange. So is there anyone else before I introduce the speaker? Okay, great. So this morning we are thrilled to have...
I'm sorry.
Yes?
I was actually going to chime in. I'm sorry I took so long. This is Kareem Karanda. I'm actually in North Carolina, and I did a officer wellness workshop to talk about stress and how it impacts their fitness for duty. We had about roughly 20 folks, 20 officers, deputies, and police officers attend, and former police officers, and it was a really good, engaging workshop. One of the challenges I'm having is being able to make the environment safe for officers to be able to share. There's a lot of concern about whether or not the information they share will get back to their administration. So there's this the stigma of mental health and fitness for duty is a huge barrier to some of these officers that are struggling in silence, getting the help that they need. And so many of them will rather stay hush instead of getting the help, and then it's complicating other areas of their lives, divorce, domestic violence, alcoholism, and things of that nature. So I plan on hosting some additional ones because I think when it comes to something new, it's just a matter of consistency to create that comfort level with it, if you will. And so I plan on hosting actually a fatherhood event later on this month, and then I'm going to go back into the Office of Wellness in my area.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe President Cox can address some of that in the conversation this morning. So with that, I'm going to pivot to introducing the National President of Noble, Clarence E. Cox III. He currently serves as Director of Special Projects in the Office of the Chief for the Fulton County Police Department and is the former Director of Safety and Security for Clayton County Public Schools and its first Chief of Clayton County School Police. Clayton County is the fifth largest public school system in the state of Georgia. He began his law enforcement career in 1981 with the City of Atlanta Bureau of Police Services, and throughout his career he's worked numerous assignments, which includes an extensive career in local, state, federal specialized law enforcement units. His previous service comprises undercover drug enforcement as an agent and a commander, special weapons and tactics team member and commander, and he was an original member of the Georgia Homeland Security Fusion Center member and aviation unit pilot and commander. That's a lot. I'll let him explain what that means. I'm mindful that you want me to condense this, so I'll just share a few more things. He was born and raised in Atlanta. I'm also from Georgia, so glad to have a fellow Georgian on, and he's very active in Ebenezer Baptist Church. He attended Booker T. Washington High School, Morehouse College, so it's fitting that we're having the Noble Seminar there today, and Ashford University. He's graduated from several law enforcement executive training programs, and yes, I will stop there, and has received numerous awards for his contributions to law enforcement and community engagement. And I just want to add that I met Mr. Cox at the Congressional Black Caucus Legislative Conference last September and got to see him speak on multiple panels, and it was just really refreshing to hear his perspective as someone who's been in law enforcement for so long. So I'm very excited to welcome him to the call this morning. So, Mr. Cox, if you can star 6 to unmute, welcome to Mob United.
Good morning, all.
Good morning.
I'm humbled by the privilege to have this conversation this Saturday morning about some of the things that are near and dear to my heart. I'd like to first thank you for the invitation and consistent dialogue that we've had over the last couple of weeks and since we met at the CBC. I'd like to also thank my Noble sisters, Dr. Charles and Michelle Teje, who are also on the call, and any other Noble members that didn't introduce themselves. I'd like to first start by saying that the work that you guys are doing is awesome in my mind, and I applaud you for that. And, you know, there's groups all over the country doing similar work, but the commitment that I hear and see from this group is outstanding. And again, I applaud you for what you do. And I'm hopeful that and prayerful that you'll get others to join you and make this movement just, you know, the largest and most productive around. But a little bit about Noble. It was obviously started in 1976. And the reason it was started was because back then there was an issue with crime, much like it is today, and it was predominantly in the low-income areas. And a bunch of black law enforcement officials were called to Washington, D.C. for a 3-day symposium, and it was sponsored by the Joint Center for Political Studies. And during that time, there was conversations during the networking period that led to the fact that there was similar problems across the country that were not being addressed, and particularly in our communities. And so these group of individuals decided that the 3-day symposium that was not originally designed for this conversation would have to be extended by a future conversation and several future conversations. So with that being said, Noble was born with that original organization. Hello? Hello?
Okay, we hear you now. There's a lot of static for a minute. Okay,
yeah, somebody came in. So back to my point about Noble's origin. So the attendees from this symposium that represented over 50 cities around America and across the country decided that they would continue to have this dialogue and create a more comprehensive group. So Noble was born in 1976. Today we have over 50 chapters, and we represent more than 3,000 members across the country, and we represent largely 47% of major cities that are led by African-American men and women across this country in the major cities. We either serve as police chiefs, assistant chiefs, or commanders. And I'm really proud of the state of North Carolina, where we boast about the 5 black female chiefs that are Noble members in the state of North Carolina. We have several programs, and we've served over 60,000 youth with our programs, which include a lot about mentoring, education, leadership development, and obviously safety. We found in the last several years that the narrative in our black community has become increasingly worse with the shooting of unarmed black males, and particularly the use of force issues with people of color. And we've designed some programs, and you spoke of it earlier. The Law in Your Community is a program that was designed specifically after Ferguson to address the need for our young men and women to have a conversation or an encounter with law enforcement that they would survive. Many would say that law enforcement has taken a turn for the worse, and I tend to agree in a lot of ways, especially under the new administration. Under the previous administration with President Barack Obama, we began to try to turn the tide in a positive direction when the development of the 21st century policing was designed, and it was a bunch of practitioners along with folks that were not necessarily law enforcement. It was educators, law enforcement practitioners, folks from the medical field, psychologists, and so on. This administration currently has removed most of the safeguards that we enjoyed during the Obama administration and reversed those things in a way that it's having a negative impact on our communities. And we're advocating that all of our chiefs are participants of the 21st century policing doctrine. And that is the latest doctrine as it relates to policing in this country. And it's the most positive document that I know of that would ensure equity and justice in our communities. And Noble's mission is to ensure equity in the administration of justice in those communities. And we're committed by making sure that we monitor a lot of these things. And oftentimes people are, I guess, frustrated because Noble is very careful on how we approach these things, and that we don't put ourselves in a worse position with these similar acts that occur with the unarmed shooters. And I heard someone say earlier about how the officers are sometimes reluctant to come up and talk about the pains that they suffer, but I assure you that we are human and we're part of the community. So when these shootings occur, we're hurting just as much as the folks who are non-law enforcement in our communities. And our goal is to try to change this narrative through education and obviously through policy like you guys are doing. And we attend meetings regularly. I'm in D.C. most of the week, most weeks this year, fighting with and I say fighting, and I mean fighting, with the current administration because of some of the policies and the reverses that were, that I'd like to say that we're going to make a positive change in our profession. They're being reversed, and we're continually speaking up and speaking out about these things, and I'll share with you some of those shortly. As I keep alluding to this signature program, the Law in Your Community, it's nationally recognized, and it's in communities across the country. And I'm proud to say that the Chicago public school system adopted this as part of their curriculum, and young men and women are being taught some of the principles that are outlined in that program. Since December of 2014, we've impacted over 23,000 young folks across the country, over 270 communities. And I brag about that because we feel that it's made a significant impact with the educational part. I often tell people that we are fearful of things that we don't understand or things that we don't clearly know. And I think that a lot of the fear that we have in our communities as it relates to the engagement with law enforcement is because of our communication skills. You know, when I grew up, it was yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, and there was a clear understanding of the consequences that were associated with my deviant acts, as my mother would call them. Today, it's a whole lot different, and we in law enforcement have had to adapt to those new changes. And everybody hasn't embraced those changes to, I guess, communicate in a positive manner. I often talk about the fact that cell phones and smartphones have increased our technology, but it didn't help us with our communication. Where we used to have a conversation, we now enjoy that conversation through text or email. And whether you agree with me or not, I think that is a very, I guess, a turning point in our communication skills throughout all the different communities, and especially communities of color. Communication, as most of you know, is key to any relationship, and part of the curriculum and the law in your community centers around the communication, and it's how I talk to you and how you talk to me, what you should expect from me and what I should expect from you. And many times I think we're lost, and those incidents occur because of the failure to communicate properly. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're involved in right now. And I heard a brother, I want to say that he was from North Carolina, talk about a law enforcement wellness seminar that he held recently. And I applaud your efforts on that. I too have been involved in that. The Bureau of Justice Assistance and the U.S. Department of Justice Community Policing Office has recently sponsored some conversations centered around that space. And I agree with you wholeheartedly about the trust factor when it comes to relaying problems in law enforcement. A lot of my colleagues will not admit that they have problems. And so for that, I have advocated, and I continue to advocate for a 800 hotline that officers around the country would be able to speak with somebody who would be able to provide some sort of assistance in that area. And, you know, obviously with the recent suicides of popular folks in our community, there has been a different approach, and there's been more attention focused on the mental health issues. And mental health creates a serious problem in law enforcement because, unfortunately, our country doesn't take mental health seriously, and a lot of our folks that are in jail and in jails across the country are there for a simple reason. There's not any bed space or any real mechanisms to address mental health. And I speak with sheriffs all the time who talk about the fact that somebody's in jail because they were unable to function in society in the correct manner, and someone decided to arrest them because there was no other mechanism. So then the sheriffs are tasked with trying to treat them in jails. So you would really look at this as jails are probably the largest mental health facilities in our country, and that's an unfortunate truth. One of the other issues we talk about is the use of force and the need for police reform. And I'm proud to say that Dr. Charles, who is on the phone, is part of our think tank group, and of Noble, and she does great work to try to address some of those things. But one of the things we see is that because there's over 18,000 law enforcement agencies across this country, policies and procedures are various, and they range from one end of the spectrum to another. Therefore, there's not a clear, concise operating manual, if you will, to address some of these things in the application of use of force. However, there's a use of force continuum that most agencies would use when applying use of force. That's anywhere from putting your hands on someone to the application of a firearm. And that's not often used these days. It appears that, a lot of times you see, and we just recently saw in Mesa, Arizona, the application of force. And I would submit to you that based on what I've viewed, the use of force continuum was not used. And we've spoken out about that and actually released a statement about that most recent use of force issue in our media. One of the other things I'll speak about is we found that this doesn't just start in the teen cycle of our young folks' life. This starts actually in the elementary. There's a couple of recent studies about the disproportionate number of African American boys disciplined in our school systems, and we feel that that's a great contributor to some of the issues that we're seeing on the street. What we're finding is that a lot of our young men are being expelled or suspended from school, and mom and dad, or mom without a dad, has to have some kind of mechanism to have this child some kind of care when she is, or they're both at work. And oftentimes these kids go unsupervised and oftentimes end up in trouble with law enforcement because they're not in the home where they're supposed to be, and they're out on the streets committing crimes in juvenile offenses. And we've got to get some kind of understanding with the schools and the school systems, and we've asked for a meeting with School Superintendent Betsy DeBose to talk about these issues as it relates to the discipline in our schools. Many of our children are giving EIPs and pretty much puts them in a special education program and removes them from the mainstream classroom, and these kids are failing miserably, and they're going by the wayside. And if you look at other demographics, it's a large gap between African American men and a lot of our African American females in the other ethnic groups. So that's a concern of ours. And lastly, because I could speak a lot about other things, but one of the other things that we're focused on right now, when the government came out with this opioid epidemic, all of a sudden it became a health crisis. And as a large part of my career has involved drug enforcement, I'm extremely concerned and angered that when it was cocaine and it was affecting African American neighborhoods, it was the war on drugs. And what I'm hearing from my colleagues at the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Department of Defense, metric tons of cocaine are not being interdicted anymore because of this increased effort to prevent opioid addiction. And if you look at the recent legislations as it relates to the opioids, the president has put a large amount of money toward the treatment part of this and a very small amount toward the prevention, and almost no money toward the enforcement of this. And it's obviously a discriminatory practice in my mind and others, because crack cocaine plagued the black communities in a bad way, and heroin has been in a lot of our communities in a bad way. And it was always this war on drugs. And now, because it's not necessarily plaguing the African American and brown communities, it's a health epidemic, and monies have been removed from the Department of Health and Human Services and others to combat this problem. But if we see a surge of cocaine like we did in the early 80s, and I'm told it's going to be that way, our communities are going to suffer again. We've been very vocal about our dislike or non-agreement of mass incarceration, and that was one of the unintentional consequences with the mandatory minimum sentences. And we've been very vocal about our displeasure with that. And what we're going to see again, folks, is a new initiative called Safe Communities. And you're seeing them, if you're paying attention to what's going on around Chicago, the government has decided that Superintendent Johnson and the Chicago Police Department are not capable of enforcing the laws in that area, and they're needing some help from federal agents. And as recent as day before yesterday, a alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agent was ambushed outside of Indiana, but he was assigned to the Chicago Field Division. Those guys have put additional resources in the Chicagoland area to prevent gun violence and to reduce gun violence. But what you're going to see as these things develop is another mass incarceration initiative. We recently visited with General Sessions, the Attorney General of the United States, where he talked about the fact that federal prisons are not as crowded as they once were under the Obama administration. And whether you agree with that or not, they have an initiative now with the Safe Streets to start what I call mass incarceration. And largely, it's in part to feed those federal subsidized prisons. There's a lot of money in private prisons right now, and a lot of those folks are obviously have relationships with the White House, and most recently, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, decided that he would embark on prison reform, which in large part will be effective for African Americans and our brown brothers. A lot of it's involving the immigration and ICE conversations around the DACA. And we've got to have voices that are speaking up against this, or we were going to see mass incarceration again. I don't think we'll see the minimum mandatory sentences anymore. I think that was, something that affected a lot of people, that it was unintentional, but we certainly have to speak up and speak out about this desire to incarcerate more people. We have talked with the commissioner of the NYPD. As you know, many of you may know, New York has decided that they will not enforce marijuana laws out on the street anymore, and we don't have any opposition to that. And Michelle explained to me last night that there will be issued citations. You still have an ability to arrest somebody, but the desire originally will be to issue a citation for someone who's in possession or consuming misdemeanor amounts of marijuana. And I think that will kind of help reduce some of the officer contact that could lead to some of the use of force issues that we're seeing. But we have to, and I ask you mothers, and this came up also yesterday, ask you mothers, speak to your children about the use of narcotics, and particularly marijuana, because most people think it's a harmless drug and there's no need to be concerned, because in a lot of states it's obviously becoming legal. But I caution you with that, and we talked about this, like I said yesterday. Our black kids are smoking marijuana in cars, which gives a police officer the probable cause to start a further investigation to determine if there's any other crimes being committed or if there's a larger amount of narcotics in that vehicle. You very seldom see white kids or other ethnic groups consuming marijuana in vehicles, and that's why I think a lot of the encounters between people of color are increasingly more in numbers because our consumption is anywhere we decide to do it. White kids, that doesn't mean white kids aren't consuming narcotics. They're just not doing it in the public or in areas that they will be detected. So, as we talk to our kids, that's one of the things we've got to really hone in on and let them know that, you're creating more of a problem by your desire to use this drug, but if you're going to use it, certainly don't use it in a vehicle because the smell is going to be there, and the officer's out doing his job, he's going to smell that, and, further consequences could occur. I'm going to stop right there. Oh, well, the other one piece that I'll talk about is the gun violence. We've been working a lot about the gun violence because obviously it's not only in our communities, it's in our schools. And we have been very vocal about the fact that the president originally talked about arming teachers and the cost that it would, be astronomical to try to arm teachers. And I just feel, and Noble has agreed, that to arm a teacher would be useless in these kinds of situations. The teachers have such a hard job as it is trying to educate our children and provide the other resources that they need on a daily basis. And to arm a teacher and create further consequences would be totally, unjust. And so we asked for an increase from the Department of Education for school resource officers and technology to increase the safety of our schools, because if the resource officers are used like they should be, and that's to protect the students, staff, and visitors of that campus, that's going to be a significant increase to the security. School resource officers should not be used in a disciplinary act because that is not what it's designed for. And if you've got a good school resource officer program going on in your community, that's going to be positive interaction with law enforcement. And many of these young folks don't have positive interaction with law enforcement. And most times, their first encounter with law enforcement is doing a traffic stop or some other encounter in the community. So it's an A+ for me if we have positive school resource programs across the country, because that helps with the engagement that we need with our young folks, and it helps to influence a lot of times the outcomes of their lives as they encounter law enforcement in the community. I'll stop right there and open up for any questions or anything I may have omitted during mine.
Okay, thank you so much. So that was a lot to unpack. So we are going to open it up to questions. Again, if you have a question, don't forget you have to unmute yourself, *6. But I'm actually going to start with the first question just based on something you said on communication skills. So, I get your point on needing to improve communication all around, but I just want to know your perspective on how much that would actually help, especially in many of the situations we see of unarmed black males being killed. Tamir Rice never had a chance to communicate, neither did Stephon Clark. Philando Castile, from all that we saw, communicated respectfully, and that wasn't enough. So my question is a two-part question. One, how much do you think better communication would actually help? And more importantly, why are so many law enforcement officers afraid of black people, particularly black males, to the point that just the sight of them holding a cell phone, a rock, whatever, causes them to shoot to kill?
That's a lot to digest, but I'm
yeah.
the last one. And this is totally my perspective, and I haven't done any studies or anything, but I've asked that studies be conducted on this. When I came on the job back in the old days, and I'm dating myself, most of my colleagues were Vietnam-era veterans of some kind of war. And those guys fought in jungles, and the terrain that they fought in was not like the terrain that many of our soldiers today are fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. Look outside your windows. That's what it looks like in the theaters that these guys are fighting across the pond now. So it's my thoughts, and only my thoughts, that a lot of these folks are returning soldiers who are being employed by agencies across the country, because most bosses would consider a returning veteran as a good fit for law enforcement, because we offer paramilitary agencies. And so when we hire these guys, they've been trained, and they've been trained in a different way than law enforcement. My theory is that in the Army or the armed services, any branch, you're taught to eliminate the threat. So in that, you come back to the United States to work in a law enforcement agency, and you've been used to eliminating the threat across the pond. And now when you're in fear of your life, because that's part of the use of force continuum, you decide that you're going to apply this force, and it's not to subdue anymore or to use only that force necessary to, stop the threat. Your mindset has been trained to eliminate the threat. And I say this with no scientific data to back that up, but I just feel that from conversations that I've had, a lot of these guys are amped up from the military, and they did not get deprogrammed. They've received this training, and training has been so repetitious, and those applications of force across the pond, that's where they are. I cannot say that that's the truth for all of these incidents, because all of these people are not returning veterans. I'll say this part for the remainder of the folks. Because some folks who are hired in these situations are from areas that may have not had a diverse community, they have difficulties understanding our culture and how we do business. And that's why I'm such an advocate for the 21st century policing doctrine, because it calls for agencies to make their agency represent the diversity of the community. So while some of these folks don't understand how we communicate or what we do and what's normal for us, it's a challenge for them, and they feel somewhat intimidated, if that answers that question. Mm-hmm. The other part, do I think communications would have helped? I always think communications would help, because, if we do what's right, and that's the whole part about community engagement. I tell folks all the time, we got to get this right on both sides. The cops have to learn to engage in the community in a positive way, but the community has to accept that engagement, and they have to do their part as well, and that doesn't always happen. I refer back to the situation at Yale when the young lady was accusing the officers of abusing her privileges to be in a dormitory room. I was in agreement. I spoke with the chief there, and I saw the videos over and over, and at no time did those officers, in my mind, based on training and what I know, best practices, violate that young lady's rights. And being a former chief at a college institution as well, oftentimes folks from the community who had nowhere to live would come into dormitory rooms and sleep. So I felt that the officers were in their right to check to see if this woman had the right, if you will, to be on that campus and to be in the space that she was in. And if you really paid close attention to that video, at the very end, the young lady got in the elevator and she was smiling when she said, "Y'all will hear from me again. This ain't over." And that was not the demeanor of somebody who had their rights violated. That's just not consistent with that. So I say that to say there's times when we don't always agree with the things that officers do and they're not right, but there's also times when the community didn't handle it right also. And I'll speak really quick about the Philadelphia incident. When the Philadelphia incident occurred, I called the chief, who's a noble member and a friend, and I said, "Rich, I don't like the way you said what you said. on the TV about we had the right to do what we did, and we did that. We oftentimes have the right to do it, but my question is also, is it the right thing to do? And sometimes it's okay to just say, we're going to walk away from this and live to see another day. So that's all I'm saying about that one.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that, especially the last part. So I want to open it up to other people. If you have a question, please press *6.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good morning. So my question goes back to communication and kind of piggybacking on what DePelsha said. I agree communication is key in whatever form that is. I know geographically there's some differences on how children are raised, but I think that communication should always be respectful. My question would go to those who communicate differently. So that person who may be brown-skinned but doesn't speak English and may not understand. But even more over than that, going to those individuals with mental illness or some sort of diagnosis that's not evident when you look at them. We have, several instances where individuals who are unable to communicate in the same way that you and I are able to communicate, who have been victimized by police. So what do we do then?
That's why we are promoting de-escalation training and other new methods of dealing with these things. And I think oftentimes when we get in trouble with situations like what you're referring to, it's because we're in a hurry. Most cases, time is on our side. We have time to figure this out, and we don't always take time. Over my decade of policing, things have changed. Where when there was a threat, we would surround the scene and wait for backup and do all these neat things. And now things have been changed in other respects to go straight to the issue. Well, I think oftentimes we get it confused. There's always room for improvement in this, but I think what we don't do is take time. Sometimes we have to step back, take a breath, and analyze this situation. If you are not having effective or positive communications, there's all kinds of tools available out there that we can utilize that we don't often think about in the heat of the battle. And I think that's part of what's going on.
Hello?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, can I say something?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'd like to say two things. Number one, when it comes to answering the question of why are officers so quick to shoot, I think it's a conditioning that we all have, this conditioning that black and brown skin is bad, it's a threat, it's stronger, and so there's a fear factor there when it comes to coming upon a scene of some black folks and not knowing what the circumstances are. And I think with law enforcement getting some multicultural training, also that officer wellness piece, if they have that type of training as it relates to how to get through your job, then I think with the things that they deal with as far as burnout, when they come upon a scene of such, they won't be so quick to shoot because they will, through these trainings, they will learn how to be unconditioned that black and brown skin is bad. As it relates to communication, law enforcement is held to a higher standard. So if you have some officers that are dealing with burnout and they are frustrated, baby, then their intent, depending on how they speak to that suspect or individual or the community, if they can have that professionalism in their communication, then it will be reciprocated. It may not be reciprocated off the bat because the community feels a certain type of way about law enforcement, but if they continue to hold that their standards higher, then I think eventually, and learn how to, again, talk to the community, maybe pull a person to the side to talk to them one-on-one will also help in that. But when law enforcement removes their professionalism and talks to an individual any type of way, then they lower the bar, and then the community is going to respond because, again, they're held to that higher standard and they're expected to behave in that way. And so when they don't, because they're human, because they're dealing with stuff on the job, because they're coming up on a scene where people feel some type of way about them and disrespect them, I get how they can easily, in their human nature, decide, well, I'm not dealing with this today. But because they're in that uniform, they are still held to that higher standard. And I think with training that we can combat some of these issues, which are very normal and human. And that's what I had to say.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think you made a number of good points. So I want to try to package it into a follow-up question. One, I think she makes a good point on communication. You talk about our communication skills, but what kind of training are law enforcement officers getting in terms of how to communicate with the community? Because often these situations are escalated because of the way they approach people. It's disrespectful, it's unprofessional, it's degrading, it's this tone of you must do exactly what I say or else, and the else is your life is on the line. You're the only one with a gun. We don't have a gun. So I think like the communications training, also she touched on diversity and implicit bias training. We've talked about de-escalation. So I would just love to hear more about what kind of training are most officers getting. Like when we hosted a forum in D.C. for CBC, the officer we had on the panel there said that officers are trained to shoot to kill. Like it used to be shoot to harm or disable, but now like you're told that you have to protect your life more than anything else, not protect the community, but make sure you get home safely. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on how officers are being trained and what improvements there may be that we can make there.
Very good question, and I appreciate the fact that the caller said something about the human side of it. As I stated earlier, there's over 18,000 police departments in this country, and the training varies from agency to agency. That's why we are advocating for police reform to come up with one standard police training and mandatory training on diversity and, the de-escalation and things of that nature. The problem that we have is because many of those 18,000 law enforcement agencies are very small and very, I would say more than half of those smaller agencies don't receive any specialized training for various reasons. Cost effective. For example, in a little small town in Alabama that has 5 officers and a chief, they can't afford for their officers to be away from the department to attend these various trainings to get a lot of the, updated training because of the call volume and the community, the situations in the community. And so when you talk to a lot of chiefs who are in that situation, they're frustrated because they know there's a need, but they've got to make a decision. And a lot of times when governments, the mayors and the county managers and others are talking about the expenditures as it relates to law enforcement, they're not putting that money there. So that's why you see a lot of times the things that we saw in Ferguson with the various jurisdictions becoming money-making entities or agencies because they depend largely on the revenues of traffic citations or arrest citations, and their budgets are so small that that's what they rely on to supplant, if you will, the normal operating budgets, and that's problematic. So I guess to answer your question, there is training available, and there's all kinds of state-of-the-art training that is coming out, and we have a lot of practitioners out there providing good training, but I guess CEOs or the folks in charge a lot of times don't necessarily see that it's a need because it's not affecting them at that time. So, again, we're back to the need for the 21st century policing doctrine to be demanded in the community. When I talk to a lot of folks in the community, I said, if your chief is not practicing 21st century law enforcement, you should demand that he or she does, and you shouldn't take anything less than that, because that's going to get you where you need to be with the proper service, the proper engagement, and the latest techniques in law enforcement.
And can you just talk a little bit more about that? You've mentioned it a couple of times, and everyone may not be equally familiar with the 21st century policing document. So can you just highlight a few things from that you think we should be most focused on pushing for?
Yeah. This was commissioned under President Barack Obama to look at and examine the current way that we do policing in our country. And it had been many years since there had been a real look at policing in this country. And it was his desire, because of all of the shootings and the use of the force across the country, that we take a deep dive and look at how we could better serve our communities. And as a result of that, there was a study published, and I invite all of you to take a look at it. You can Google it, and it's out there and available. That you should look at it and look at the 6 pillars of this report that are very, in my mind, very essential to having a good police department. And if, like I said, if your agencies are not engaged in that, then that's a problem. And one of the things they talk about is the engagement of the police and the community. They talk about the technology and the training part that many of you have talked about today on the phone. It talks about the use of the technology that's available. And hang on just one second. And also it talks about how we build the public trust. The public trust piece talks about treating people with dignity and respect, and giving the folks the voice in those encounters. And the recommendation is how we come to what a lot of things that Noble is doing. We feel that, and I like to say this, I look at the investment in the community like a savings account. You got to start investing in that savings account before there's a need to make a withdrawal. And if you made a proper investment in that savings account, when it's time to make a withdrawal, you should be okay because you've made a previous investment. You can't engage with the community and think that you're going to be able to be successful in that community if you haven't made the investment. So if you look at this 21st century police document, it talks much about this investment. You've got to have some policies and some oversight that are going to be beneficial for a positive outcome. And you've got to have some real community policing strategies that will help you in the reduction of crime. And that doesn't mean over-policing. That means that the community policing should be a philosophy and not a program. A lot of communities think, well, if I get 3 guys and assign them to community policing and they go out and, have these community affairs events and show off all our good, neat equipment, that's community policing. That's not community policing. community policing is largely involving where your community has some input on the services they get. You know, you go to Walmart to buy something, there's a greeter there saying, welcome to Walmart, but he's not going to tell you what you should get when you get to Walmart. You go in and you pick what you want and you get it and you come out. And similar to what you should get with your services, if you've got real community policing, you will have community engagement where the community has some sort of input into the way the services are delivered in that community. It also talks about the training and education that you guys keep bringing up. If you are totally engaged in 21st century policing, you will have the proper training and the education that's needed. And the other part, in the brother from, I think, Carolina talked about was the officer wellness and safety part. You'll find that a lot of times when there's a use of force application with officers, it's because he or she is out of shape and they're not necessarily engaged in good physical conditions. So I think with the 6 pillars of community policing, you will find that that will get you in your community where you need to be if that's being applied in the right way. And those are the key components of it: the building of trust and legitimacy, writing correct policies, and having oversight. Oversight is the greatest part of this, because if you don't have oversight, you can have all the policies in the world. If you don't have oversight, the policies are obviously no good.
Right.
And a great example, and I'll share this with you. Recently, I was in Chicago with Chief Johnson, Superintendent Eddie Johnson, and he wrote a policy that says that you can no longer use a taser on people who are intoxicated by drugs or alcohol. Well, as soon as he released that policy, he got pushback. The union, the FOP, filed a lawsuit against that policy. And many of you on this phone probably wondering why. So was I, because to me, that's doing the right thing. That's oversight. There's no real need to use a taser on someone who's already, intoxicated and probably not in his or her full faculties. The problem I see in a lot of agencies across the country, and I'll tie this up, is that organized labor can also prevent a good chief from doing a great job because of the disagreements or the arrangements that the unions have made in their contracts. A lot of chiefs are not going to be successful. Real quick, the one in Mesa, Arizona that just took place, that chief has taken a lot of heat from the local union there because he released the video. And I think transparency has to be a part of a legitimate agency. I applauded the chief for his efforts to release that video immediately, and I think the public needs to know what's going on.
All right, thank you so much for sharing that. We actually have a couple of questions in chat that I'm going to read related to what you were talking about. Also, just wanted to share that our chapter leader in Columbus, Georgia, just posted that their Noble Seminar is underway, and she posted a picture of a packed house with a room full of mostly young males who appear to be teenagers. So that is going well. But the question is, and I'm going to combine two people's questions because they're similar. Can you speak on hiring criteria for police officers with regard to weeding out those with implicit biases, and how quickly officers are rehired once fired from another police department, particularly after being caught on social media for bad police? Then the other person says, does Noble have suggestions or policy ideas about a state or national registry to prevent problem officers from getting rehired in different jurisdictions, something like the bar for attorneys?
Wow, all of those are great questions. I'll start with the one about the registry. There is not one to date available. However, I have been advocating, and Noble has been advocating, for a use of force database. And what that entails is every agency submits to the FBI a reporting of their use of force applications. And my reasoning for that is, one, it will help us to do better. Two, there's no known database other than what is seen in the media from the Washington Post. They seem to be collecting data from around the country about use of force applications, and we have no real way of disputing what they report because there's nothing collected officially. And so we wrote during the pilot program to agencies and asked them to opt in. It was voluntary. And out of the 18,000 agencies, less than 200 originally volunteered. Since that, I've been on a campaign to increase the participation, and I think the last check, we were up to about 1,300. And I'm proud to say that better than it was. It's not where it needs to be, but there's still work to be done, and we're continuing with that. The standards, I think the question was
around how do you screen people out from the beginning who have bias and prevent them from getting rehired?
Again, that's another, a big difference in a lot of agencies. So many larger agencies conduct psychological exams and a battery of tests to determine the mental stability of the applicant. And then there are several agencies that can't afford to do that. So you fill out an application, they do a background check, and they swear you in. And I think if we had police reform and standards across the board that would be the same, we could fill that gap and make sure that everybody had a psychological examination before being hired. But every agency in the country does not do that. And as it relates to a database to prevent folks from being fired and then hired, that's a great need for that. Just recently in Georgia, there was a case where a police officer used his car to effect an arrest on a perpetrator who was fleeing, and as a result of that, he was fired immediately within 24 hours from that police department because of his violation of the policy. That wasn't normal policy in that agency, and he was hired less than 24 hours from the firing at another agency. So yes, there's a need for that because, let's say an officer gets in trouble about something he or she did, and the agency decides to allow them to resign before being terminated. Then oftentimes those people go unchecked, and they do go to other agencies and continue perpetrating those same violations of law and or policy that they did at the previous agency. So that would be a welcome change to our profession and a much needed change.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Hey, this is Kareem again from North Carolina. I'm actually a licensed therapist and a clinical addiction specialist, and one of the things about the psychological exams that are issued to cadets or people who are coming into the profession is that they don't gauge, or they're not able to determine the long-term mental health deterioration of an officer over the course of their career. So an officer may come into the profession with a well mental health, but over time, the exposure to trauma and different events can compromise that. So the psychological exams can be defeated with socially favorable answers, and so it's very difficult for that alone to weed out bad apples, if you will. However, I truly believe, and going back to what you said earlier in the program, that I think what can complement this deficit is making counseling mandatory. Officers have access to a 1-800 hotline, but I think if counseling is made mandatory, it will, in fact, eliminate, number one, the stigma, and also provide education to officers who may, in fact, be suffering in silence but not understand what it is that they're suffering with, especially when the burnout takes place over the course of their career. There were several things that I wanted to touch on as it relates to the politics, the political correctness in law enforcement as well, as it relates to communication. I've attended a ton of town hall meetings where there's never a forthright answer. There's a lot of verbiage, but the answers to the questions are never addressed at its core. And when we have communication barriers where there's politics involved, or if people who come from lower income neighborhoods play by a different set of rules of engagement, it becomes difficult to navigate those things, especially when the perspectives are so distinctively different. You know, you have one community in the lower population who day to day are trying to get through their stressors and seek survival, if you will, selling drugs to provide for my family type of concept, whereas it plays into the hands of what law enforcement officers enforce. So there's a social narrative as well that's impacting the way police officers engage with young black men in many of these communities. And I've done workshops on these things as well, and it's this ideology that if we don't know how to understand how the institutions across the board, whether it's education, whether it's the justice system, whether it's the pharmaceutical companies, how all of these institutions play a role in creating this condition, such as the third grade pipeline to prison, if you will. If your third grade reading scores are not up to snuff, then it's highly likely you will end up in the prison population. How all these institutions strategically play a part in how we see the problems playing out today. If we don't address that, then I don't believe anything will change. It's just going to be fluff.
I certainly agree to the psychologicals not being able to weed out. And you're right. Many officers are suffering from PTSD, obviously responding from one traumatic call to another. And you know, if you really think about it, an officer may, on the beginning of his tour, show up at a homicide where someone has taken their life. And then, you know, he or she writes a report, goes back into service, and goes out and answers a wreck call where a child's killed. And all of those things have to be kind of erased from your mind for you to continue doing the job. So you're right. And the other piece about what you said, many of them are reluctant, and I don't know that a screening internally would be sufficient, because most officers are reluctant, because if you go out there and tell the truth about how you're really feeling, it's the CEO's obligation to remove you from the streets because you're now a liability. So when an officer has to gauge whether he's going to go and say, hey, I got a problem, you know, I need to talk to somebody, and the chances of him being removed from duty and either suspended or placed on some kind of administrative leave with or without pay, and he or she's not able to support a family, that becomes problematic. So you're right. That's why you don't see that, and that's why there's a high likelihood of substance abuse and divorce in this profession.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a lot. We have a couple of people in chat who've asked to ask questions, so I want to ask if Lauren from Chicago can ask her question first, and then Monique.
And DePelcha, if I could say something after, it's CK.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. This is Lauren Johnson from Chicago. I'm a retired youth development professional, and previous to that, I was a corporate diversity trainer, so I'm kind of tired right now. So I'm going to try to keep my questions pointed because I'm in Chicago. And you talked about the law in your community program. I'd like for you to describe that. Have any evaluations been done? What were the objectives and what were the results? And I know that's a lot, but if you can kind of summarize it. Then you talked about safe streets, and that seemed in direct opposition to the first program. So maybe I'm a little confused there. Or is it because of our political setup going to always be schizophrenic like that? And the third thing is I never heard anybody talk about relationships. I heard you talk about investments. The only relationships I've ever seen a police officer in Chicago build is within the public schools, and those are those resource officers. Why isn't that just I hate to be naive, a norm. That
Okay.
it's about relationships. It's not about bias training, or it's a relationship with the community. And when you kind of laughed about the basketball tournament or whatever it was, I'm serious. That needs to come back. That needs to come back. I don't know the police officers in my community. I've been over here 20 years. So I know that was kind of a lot, but you unloaded a lot too, and thank you.
Okay, and thank you for your questions. As it relates to relationships, I think you may have not heard me, but I said that I feel like the engagement in the community and building the relationship and trust is key and important, and it's like a savings account. That's what I said about that. And as it relates to relationships, you get out of it what you put in it. And obviously, if we're looking for positive outcomes, we've got to do just what you're saying and make those investments. And you may have gotten a little bit confused as I talked about the safe street. That's not something that we advocate for. That's not something that we agree with, because I think that you're going to see over-policing in those initiatives. And that's something that President Trump and Attorney General Sessions has mandated for federal agencies to become involved in the law enforcement efforts around Chicago. Obviously, the spotlight has been on Chicago for the gun violence for years, and it's, in my mind, beginning to be more politicized than it is the empathy for it and the real serious commitment to it. I certainly think that the efforts are being made by the chief there and others to streamline this and to make a difference, but when you have so many other folks involved and engaged in doing your business, it becomes problematic. There has been a change, and if you really understand what's going on with the law enforcement community, the concept of community policing has been kind of I would say overstated or overused, and it's not the same in every community. So I think that's where you have a problem. And then there will be those who say that because of the volumes of calls, we don't have the opportunity to truly engage with our community. That's an excuse that I hear all the time. And so, for various reasons in various jurisdictions, policing is not going to be the same. What we're advocating in Noble, though, is that we do make those differences. You talk about the law in your community. The impact has been great. I don't have the numbers, but I would offer you can call our headquarters office or Google noblenational.org, and you can get that information. I'll make sure that you get it from the office you call. But if we can save one life, we've done something. And we think that in showing these young folks how to engage, part of this program involves role playing. And the role playing in this gives the young folk an idea of what the officer's mindset is when he or she encounters them doing these traffic pullovers. That's where most of the encounters occur. And so when the young man or woman who's participating in this program gets to play the role of the police officer and understands how critical that communication is at that particular time, we have a better outcome because they understand that officer a lot of time is fearful because you're walking up on a car with dark tinted windows filled with several occupants that you're not familiar with that may have some desire to inflict pain or injury or death on you. So when they understand what the role of that officer is, and the officer explains to them very clearly what he expects from them when he pulls up and how this should all turn out and everybody lives happily ever after, I think that serves us better. One of the things that you'll see a lot of times in these programs when we conduct them is that these folks have a mindset change. You know, most people have a negative outlook on police based on what you see on the television. You know, television has not been a good supporter of cops because most of the time a cop is either a crooked cop, he's an idiot, or you know, he's just not. There's not very many positive cop shows on the television. And one of the things that we've done is law enforcement a poor job of marketing the great things that we do. You know, you don't ever see the great things we do until something's going on in a negative manner, and we're trying to combat that with, you know, one good thing for the 5 bad things that we've done. And also during that period, we've also removed ourselves from the community in an unintentional way. We are the community. We're part of you, just like, you know, we live in the communities, we attend churches, barbershops, beauty shops, and the whole nine. And because of that, I think a lot of times, because it's us versus them mentality in our society, that's how we have such negative interactions with law enforcement.
Thank you. So I am mindful of the time. I think we, depending on how long and short the questions are, we only have time for 2 more. So I want to go back to Monique, who posted in the group. You can star 6 to unmute yourself, and then CK.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, it's Monique.
Hi.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to make these questions really quick, but just to piggyback, first, thank you for your discussion and all the good points being raised here. I had a question about restorative policing practices and whether that philosophy and principle around policing is included at all in the 21st century policing protocol. I've been reading about it and researching about it, and I know that it seems to be helpful in shifting the paradigm around how police respond to crime, and the harm that it caused, recognizing the harm, but also recognizing, the harm all the way around that the police can often cause to the community in their responses to crime. So I'm just wondering if that's included at all in the 21st century policy, and if that's something that Noble supports, seeing more restorative practices implemented in police departments.
Yes.
And then, okay.
I'll answer this real quick. We're very supportive of that. What has happened, though, in this new administration, the collaborative reforms that were placed under the Loretta Lynch Attorney General and Eric Holder Attorney General have been removed. The Sessions Justice Department feels that it's a local issue and it should be solved by that local jurisdiction. So they have removed the reforms that were placed on many of the jurisdictions that had problems, i.e. Baltimore, Seattle, and some of those. So we're fighting, and advocating that the Justice Department considers revisiting those reforms and in that the cities have punitive damages levied against them if they don't participate. And that's, in my mind, that's when you get folks' attention, when you start looking at fining people and making them spend money that would be used on other things. And I think that's where we have to get back to, and we have to advocate for collaborative reforms in agencies across the country.
Mm-hmm. And do you happen to know about how many police departments or what percentage of police departments have actually adopted the 21st century policing, or no? Are there any stats?
There's no number that I'm aware of. Because it's not a mandatory thing. It's just a thing that if you're progressive in your craft and you are a chief that has an investment in your community, those are the things you're going to be doing is instilling 21st century practices in your agency. And that's why it's up to you guys as a community to demand that these things are done. You should be in your chief's face or city council's face saying, why are we not doing 21st century policing when this is the best practices that are available to man our departments?
Okay.
Thank
so
you. And my last question.
We're going to have to stop there because we're going to run out of time, and we have at least two other questions. But thank you. Just one quick follow-up before we go to before we go to CK, because it's related to the 21st Century Youth Focused Policing. We have a question in chat from Shoshana on the first pillar of that, which is building trust and legitimacy. And she wants to know, what are two ways that we can rebuild trust at the community level?
I think being involved, you've already started that by building that trust. But, it's like anything else. We've got to do our part on our end, and you guys got to do your part. So to introduce yourselves to your police chiefs and make those relationships would be a first start, because obviously when you have a relationship with someone, you're going to figure out really soon whether that person is going to be trustworthy and that person is going to provide the best service. And I think that a large part of this is that you go out and get engaged in these community meetings. You introduce yourself to the police chiefs or your precinct commanders, or those folks who are, protecting and serving your community. And then that dialogue will lead to further conversations. And I'm sure that, when you're able to pick up the telephone and call and say, hey, look, something's going on in my neighborhood, they have a relationship with you. The service is going to increase and be better. And, that relationship is forming.
Okay, thank you. Last question, CK.
This is Dr. Charles from New York. I just want to weigh in on one minute on that last comment that President Cox mentioned. Most police departments around the country create an opportunity for members of the community to come into the station house doing roll call or doing in-service trainings for officers, and they create an opportunity for community groups to address the officer population in that command. So I would strongly suggest that you get on the calendar, mob, in your cities, get on the calendar of some of these departments' events and ask to speak, and you go and present your organizational mission and platform and take some of the young people with you as well as a part of that community engagement.
Okay, that sounds like a great idea. We'll definitely follow up on that.
Thanks, Sophia. And to bring up another point, there's another thing that's available, and thank you so much, Sophia, for that. There's also citizens police academies in a lot of jurisdictions, and I think that will give you another perspective on how things are being done in your particular jurisdictions, but that would also be a part of that relationship building.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. CK, you want to close this out?
I'll try. I'll try to foreshorten my comments really short. But so I work in a community mental health clinic for the past 30 years in New York City. And in the 80s and the 90s, whenever we call EMS, the police come, and in the 80s and the 90s, they were very aggressive. They completely disregarded staff. They would rough patients up. It was a terrible situation. It has dramatically turned around. They now come in with a plan to de-escalate. They're very deferential to the staff. And clearly something has happened. They received some kind of training, and I just want to say I can see as an eyewitness how well it works. The other very quick comment I want to make is that I was recently, 2 weeks ago, attending the law school graduation of my nephew with my son, and he was in the parking lot while waiting for us for a while, and he was kind of bouncing around. He climbed up on a wall. He went in a door. He came out. Well, the police were called, and they said they were called because there was some suspicious behavior reported. I think he handled it extremely well. He gave them his ID. He said why he was there, and then he asked if he could go over and stand by his stepfather, who happens to be white. And, everything was de-escalated. But what I said to my son afterwards was, you're a fun guy, you're a restless guy, you like to bounce around, you like to climb on things, you're kind of goofy, that's who you are. And the sad fact is, you need to be very conscious that having a black body, police may be called on you where they wouldn't be for a white boy. I just wanted to share those two comments.
Thank you so much. That is, sobering but true.
And if I could bring, please, some clarity to a statement regarding our use of marijuana and how they're addressing marijuana, at least for the NYPD. We're still in discussion regarding how that is going to look for us as officers. What they have developed is a policy regarding the citation for K2, which is for us in the East. It's the synthetic version of marijuana. So we don't want folks to go out and start saying, okay, we can start smoking and all we'll get is a citation. We still should, as President Cox shared, its location of what we're doing with that sort of behavior. But just to be clear that we still are in discussion in terms of how we're going to manage the marijuana situation.
Thank you for sharing that. And Mr. Cox, I want to thank you so much for joining us. This has been a very enlightening and riveting conversation. As you can see, we still have more questions than we could get to, so hopefully we can continue this dialogue with you and with noble representatives throughout the country, because I do believe communication is the key to bridging the gap and fostering greater understanding on all sides. So with that, I want to say thank you, and also just let everyone know next month we will not have this call in its usual format. We'll be going live in the group from the Essence Festival, so look out for announcements regarding that. We'll be live in the Facebook group. And Ms. Cox, is there anything you just want to say in closing before we close out in prayer?
I'd like to say it's been an awesome opportunity, and I appreciate this invitation. And I just encourage you to stay on the battlefield. Together we can make some change. All politics start locally. Obviously, we have some difficulties in the administration in Washington, but I think if we respectfully take care of our own jurisdictions, then we can make a change. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And if you get a chance, go over to your alma mater today at 1 o'clock for our Noble Workshop.
Unfortunately, I had planned to go, but I'm down in South Florida, and my flight doesn't leave until 2 o'clock. I had planned to be. I'll make some the next one. Okay, great. So, Chris, if you can just close us out in prayer. We want to wish everyone a wonderful weekend and have a great Father's Day weekend next weekend. And we'll be back in July.
Thank you for the opportunity.
But as it is written, eyes had not seen nor ears heard, neither have entered into the heart of man, the things which God has prepared for them that love them. Since ancient times no one has heard, no ears has perceived, no eyes have seen any God besides you, who acts on behalf of those. Father God, we trust that the victory belongs to you. We trust, Father God, that you will continue to cover our sons, our fathers, the officers that patrol our streets, Father God. We ask you to continue to bless the fathers to see another Father's Day and continue to let them know that they were created in your image. They are the head and not the tail. Therefore, the victory is you. They may not see it today, Lord, but we understand that there's changes that are happening in the law enforcement community and that the voices of the people are being heard. And God, we know that what we see today in law enforcement and what we will see in terms of the transgressions that are happening to our sons, our fathers, our brothers, Lord, we know that we will get victory at the end. And with that, I say amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone.